What's up, everybody? Got a basement bodybuilding classic today. So this is going to be a video comparing technique and our intentions when we're doing each rep for hypertrophy training versus strength training. And this is something that's messed me up quite a bit in the past, and it's something that it took me a while to realize. And looking back at one of the major reasons why I wasn't making gains for a long time, it's because of the way I lift and it's because of my technique. So today in this video, I want to help you assess where your technique is subpar and where it actually is working in your training. And I want to make sure we understand what the difference is in terms of technique with strength versus hypertrophy training, so you're actually getting what you want to out of your training and not just hoping that you're growing. So before we get into it, I do want to define the difference between hypertrophy training and strength training. I've talked about, obviously, strength training a lot in the past when I'm comparing and contrasting the two. What I want to define strength training as today, and this is what I'm generally talking about moving forwards unless I specifically say otherwise, strength training in my definition is lifting to become strong on the specific lift that you're doing. And I think that's something that most of us can agree on when we hear the term strength training. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I do get a lot of people that conflate this idea or think that I'm conflating this idea with something else. I do want to make it clear that we're talking about you're maximizing the strength output on whatever lift that you're trying to get stronger on. When it comes to hypertrophy training, this is actually going to be kind of the inverse of this. In hypertrophy training, you're going to be lifting in a way that nets you the most muscle gains. So you're purposely setting yourself up at a mechanical disadvantage to get more muscle gains out of that specific lift. So we'll dive a little bit more into that throughout this video. But what I want to start off with is targeting a muscle versus lift efficiency. So obviously with hypertrophy training, you're targeting a specific muscle. When you're training for strength, you're trying to move the weight the most efficiently that you can. So tension and range of motion on the target muscle is key for growth. One of the biggest things when it comes to maximizing muscle growth is putting tension onto that target muscle. Think disruption, which is a term that Mike Israetel uses, and I think that's the best way to think of it. When you hear the word tension, you don't really think of much. In my mind, I almost think of like a 1 rep max because it's just so much tension on your entire body. But we all know that's insufficient for actual hypertrophy. So I do like to use the term disruption. I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, and I think it resonates with a lot of people when we hear that word. Tension and range of motion on the target muscle, that's what's going to be key for growth. So you're picking a muscle, you're not really picking a movement. Obviously, you have to choose a movement to target that muscle, but the muscle's the priority. The movement adapts to maximize the growth and the disruption and tension within that given muscle. Maximizing tension, however, takes away from your strength output. So is this an issue? No. The only time it's an issue is if you're training for maximum strength. So when you're trying to output the most strength and perform on a given lift, if you're maximizing tension and range of motion on a muscle, you're obviously shortchanging yourself in terms of strength output. So if you're training for strength, that doesn't make sense. If you're training for hypertrophy, though, what happens to a lot of us is we think that we have to just get stronger, and it's heavier weights are more stimulative, right? That's not necessarily the case. When it comes to hypertrophy training, there's always going to be this little buffer room between the weight that you should be using and the weight that is possible for you to use. The heaviest weight possible for you to use will require you to sacrifice disruption and tension in the muscle you're trying to target so you can further push the strength output and the performance that you're actually attaining on that given set, on that given lift. You have to actively put yourself against the grain. You go against your instincts with hypertrophy training. When it comes to building the most strength output on a lift, your body moves instinctively. And of course, over time, you're going to be developing and improving your technique to give more performance on that given lift. But your body moves in the most efficient way possible, and you don't really have to think much about it. When it comes to hypertrophy, every second of every rep, of every set, of every session, of every workout program, you're actively putting the most tension you can into that muscle, fighting against that most efficient path. So, two totally different things. For strength output, you need to be efficient and hide your weaknesses. Hypertrophy training is the opposite. I made this mistake for years with so many lifts. I think of something like push downs where I kept getting it stuck in my head that I just have to get stronger. So I was weakest at the top end of that range of motion, where, funny enough, you actually build the most muscle. So I would just cut it out and go to 90 degrees. I kept getting stronger, and I maxed out push downs because my abs couldn't even keep up with my triceps anymore, and I would just like lift up off the ground because the weight was so heavy. But the range of motion was so insignificant that I actually didn't grow at all. So take that to something like the push down style I do now, or a JM press. The weight is much lighter, but I'm actually targeting that muscle, putting a ton of tension to it, and taking it through a full range of motion. And sure enough, I'm experiencing disruption. I'm getting a pump, and I'm feeling the muscle just kind of scream, and it's in pain. So that's a good thing. The next portion is going to be eccentrics versus concentrics. And this is where things start to get a little bit blurry. We don't know everything there is to know in terms of science with the difference between these two, but there's a couple notes that I have just from my own experience. Slow eccentrics do tend to build more muscle. They also take away from the potential to display maximal strength in a given set. You need to sacrifice load to meet your technique standards for hypertrophy. Concentrics build strength and not much muscle. You can still progress with both. This is why strength doesn't mean size is increasing or optimized. So when you want to put out the most strength possible, spending more time on the eccentric generally is just going to fatigue you a little bit more. The concentric actually has a significantly higher rate of fatigue buildup, but still taking extra time in the eccentric and even going slow enough to where you kind of lose your stretch reflex, that can impact your strength output. When it comes to hypertrophy, if you just skip the eccentric where most of the muscle is going to be built and just jump right into the concentric and take advantage of your stretch reflex or take advantage of joint reflexes like a squat or something bouncing out at the bottom, that's going to be an issue because now you're cutting out basically half the range of motion. You're building up a ton of fatigue and just doing the portion of the lift that doesn't build as much muscle. So that's where it tends to be an issue. When it comes to primary and secondary movers on a lift, this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. This is where you can really see the difference in technique. It dabbles a little bit into exercise selection, which I'll save for a future video, but when it comes to technique, the example I want to use today is going to be a JM press. There's a few different lifts, but the JM press is a good one because it's comparable to a staple lift that we all know called the barbell bench. A JM press is a good example of a lift. I'm stuttering for some reason. I guess I'm a little bit too tired from not sleeping. A JM press is a good example. I can't talk today. Is a good example of a lift where you put yourself at a mechanical disadvantage to make a specific muscle the prime mover. So you think of a JM press. If you were to just shift the bar path to your lower chest, you could press 3 times as much weight. But when you're doing a JM, you're purposely letting your elbows come back to get more range of motion for your triceps and take tension off of your chest. So in the most efficient way possible, you would just do this and press 3 times as much weight. Even if the weight's light, you can still do that and just press it 3 times easier. When it comes to training for hypertrophy, lifts with similar concepts to the JM press, they are a great option because you're certain which muscle group is taking the work and you get to choose which muscle that is by altering technique and setup. So if you're training for hypertrophy and I placed a bar on your chest and I was like, hey, press that bar up and I want you to build the most muscle you can while pressing that bar up. Obviously 1 rep isn't going to do much, but you'd say, all right, well, I'm going to go a little bit slower. I'm going to get a full range of motion and press it up in the most difficult way possible, in the most difficult bar path possible. When it comes to strength, I'd say, well, I want you to be as forceful as you possibly can when pressing that bar up. You would just do this, widen up your grip, puff your chest up a little to get an advantage on the range of motion and start a little bit higher up, press as fast as you can. Which one of those lifts do you think builds more muscle? So that's the difference between putting yourself in a disadvantage and letting your body take the naturally most efficient path. So in that example, I think it's pretty obvious that a JM press is going to build the triceps far better than a bench press would. Another good example of this that has the two overlap a little bit more is going to be a plat squat, where you shift more of the range of motion to your knees than your hips, thus putting more tension from your lower back and spinal erectors and glutes over directly to your quads. So it's little things like this that make a pretty big difference. And not just a pretty big difference. not to get extreme, but this can be the difference of you not making any gains versus you making great gains. And for myself, that was the case. When you're a beginner and you just start lifting, you don't have to worry as much about this. But I was stuck at like a late beginner, early intermediate for so long in certain muscle groups because I didn't understand how technique and range of motion worked for hypertrophy. I just focused on getting stronger. I don't want you guys to waste time just like I did for years. So I hope you're learning some of this. I do want to tie this concept back into programming though. Each muscle group gets its own lift in a hypertrophy program. That's not to say you don't see overflow growth from compound lifts and that compounds only grow one muscle, but you want to assume the lift only grows one muscle. So you don't end up with an imbalanced physique, hoping that big compound lifts develop the physique that you want. I did this for so long where I kept hearing deadlifts train every muscle, squats train your whole body, bench press hits your entire upper body. Like you don't need to do anything. Deadlifts work your lats, bench works your triceps, stuff like this. And while it's true that the muscle's going to be active, obviously when you're doing those lifts, that doesn't mean the muscle's actually going to grow. And everyone's biomechanics and leverages are a little bit different. So there are some people that can squat and just do a low bar squat and get jacked legs. I low bar squatted and I got huge glutes. I just had a giant butt from doing them, but my quads were kind of non-existent. Same with bench. I actually grew my chest pretty well, not as well as it could have been because I was cutting my range of motion, but my triceps didn't grow at all. Even when I was pressing heavy weights in terms of 1, 3, 5 rep maxes and also moderate and even high reps. I was strong on everything and I still didn't have the triceps that I should have had when you look at the numbers that I had. And I hate to use that as an example because I don't like tying size and strength together. But if I was training for hypertrophy and then maxed out for strength, by the time I'm at something like a 330 bench or a 350 bench or whatever, I probably would be much bigger than if I just kind of did a run and gun to those strength numbers, which is unfortunately what I did. And looking back, it was to my detriment, but I learned a lot. Now I have this channel talking about my mistakes that I made. So I hope this helps you. The last thing you want to do is just hope that a lift that you're doing is going to train every muscle and grow everything optimally. That's a big mistake. Train each muscle on its own. A hypertrophy program, you start with your muscle groups and then you choose your lifts. You don't choose your lifts and then your accessories to build up those lifts more. It's two different things. It's apples and oranges. Also, hypertrophy isn't performance. To tie some of this stuff back together, strength is a performance goal. So efficiency is key. You take the path of least resistance to move the most weight. A bounce can help you in the bottom of a squat while still allowing you to improve strength without needing to develop that range of motion. So when you're doing a squat for hypertrophy, you want to go down slow and come up forcefully out of the bottom of the squat. When I used to powerlift, like a lot of us would just squat like a quarter of the way down and then just dive bomb and just let our joints and stretch reflex just bounce us right back up. So we could stack on a ton of weight. And yeah, supposedly that's more stimulative, which it isn't. But our technique was garbage and none of us grew. We just kept getting stronger and our muscle size would stay the same. So it's a complete waste of time if you're training for hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is how much tension, think disruption, that's a great word, I do like that term for this, how much tension you can get out of a set up to a certain point, because then on some lifts, fatigue will start to kick in and that will just skyrocket way past the stimulus at that point, which most lifts you don't really have to worry about that much, but there are some lifts that you definitely shouldn't be doing that on, which is much less efficient for strength output. The conclusion that I want to leave this video at, before my phone runs out of storage, to maximize hypertrophy, technique comes first, and then you select a weight that maximally challenges you without breakdown of technique. To maximize strength output, your technique has to adapt to move the weight as efficiently as possible, which results in the load taking precedence over your technique. So you can see it's an adjustment of priorities between the two, and that's how we choose whether it's going to be the load that we prioritize for strength training or the technique that we prioritize for hypertrophy training, and then the load comes second to maximally challenge the technique that we're using for that given lift. So that's all I've got for today. I will see you guys in 48 to 72 hours. The next interval is what, 96? Maybe up to 96, we'll see.